The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Creek when Sheriff Jake Morrison first heard the sound that would change everything. It started as a distant drumming, like thunder rolling across the desert, but steady and rhythmic. He set down his coffee cup and stepped onto the wooden porch of his office, squinting against the bright Arizona sun. A riderless horse was galloping down the street, its reins trailing in the dirt, stirrups bouncing wildly against its flanks. The animal was lathered with sweat, white foam coating its neck and chest. Its eyes were wide with panic, and it stumbled twice before coming to a halt near the water trough outside Peterson's general store. Sheriff Morrison had seen plenty of loose horses in his 15 years wearing the badge. Sometimes they wandered off from poorly secured hitching posts. Sometimes they spooked at rattlesnakes or sudden noises. But this was different. This horse wasn't just loose, it was running from something. The animal was a fine bay mare, well-groomed despite the sweat and dust. The saddle was good quality leather, hand-tooled with silver conchos that caught the sunlight. Most telling of all, the saddlebags were still secured, and a rifle remained in its scabbard. No man would willingly abandon a horse carrying such valuable gear. Morrison approached slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. The mare's ears flicked nervously, but she didn't bolt. Years of working with horses had taught him patience. He gently grasped the trailing reins and led her to the water trough, where she drank deeply, her sides still heaving from exertion. "Easy, girl," he murmured, running his hands along her neck to check for injuries. There were scratches on her legs from thorny brush, and her hooves were packed with red clay, the kind found in the canyon country north of town. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Tom Peterson emerged from his store, wiping his hands on his apron. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, the schoolteacher, had paused on her way to the schoolhouse. Even old Walt Brennan, who spent most mornings dozing in his chair outside the barber shop, was suddenly alert and interested. "That's Ben Cartwright's mare," Peterson announced, recognizing the horse. "Saw him ride out yesterday morning with supplies for his claim up in Devil's Canyon." Morrison's jaw tightened. Ben Cartwright was a decent man, a prospector who'd been working a small gold claim about 20 miles north of town. He came to Copper Creek every few weeks for supplies, always polite, always paid in cash. He wasn't the type to lose control of his horse. "When exactly did you see him?" Morrison asked. "Round 8 in the morning. Bought coffee, beans, some hardtack. Said he'd found some promising color and wanted to work his claim for another week or two." Peterson frowned. He seemed nervous about something now that I think about it. Kept looking over his shoulder. Mrs. Hutchins stepped closer. "Sheriff, I saw 3 men ride out on the North Trail yesterday afternoon. I was hanging laundry and noticed them because they weren't local. Rough-looking men, all of them armed." Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. 3 armed strangers following the same trail as a lone prospector with gold. It painted an ugly picture. He began examining the mare more carefully, looking for any evidence of what might have happened. In the saddlebags, he found Cartwright's supplies, mostly untouched. There was also a small leather pouch containing gold dust, perhaps an ounce worth, enough to prove the man's claim was producing. What caught Morrison's attention was a folded piece of paper tucked into a side pocket. The paper was a roughly drawn map showing the location of Cartwright's claim. Someone had marked additional spots with X's and notes like "played out" and "dry hole." It looked like Cartwright had been scouting other potential claims in the area, but there was something else. Near the bottom of the map, in different handwriting, someone had written, "Midnight. Old mine shaft. Come alone." The ink was fresh, probably written within the last day. Morrison studied the writing carefully. It was crude, formed by someone not comfortable with letters. The kind of writing a man might make who'd learned late in life, if at all. This wasn't Cartwright's neat penmanship. This was someone else's message. "Doc Henley." Morrison called to the elderly physician, who was examining the horse's legs. "What do you make of these scratches?" "Doctor." Henley adjusted his spectacles and bent close to examine the mare's legs. "These are fresh. Probably from last night. The cuts are clean but shallow. likely from riding hard through thick brush. And look here. He pointed to the horse's right flank. This looks like it might be from a bullet graze. The crowd murmured nervously. A bullet graze meant shooting, and shooting usually meant trouble. Morrison felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. If something had happened to Ben Cartwright, it was his job to find out what. "I need to ride out to Devil's Canyon," Morrison announced. "Tom? Can you see that the mare gets fed and watered? Doc, I might need you to be ready in case." He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. Morrison returned to his office to gather supplies for the ride. He checked his Winchester rifle, loaded his Colt revolver, and filled his saddlebags with enough food and water for 2 days. As he worked, his mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Devil's Canyon was a rough, remote area where prospectors had been searching for gold for the past 5 years. It was perfect country for an ambush. Narrow passages between towering red rock walls, plenty of hiding spots, and far enough from town that gunshots wouldn't be heard. As Morrison saddled his horse, a gray gelding named Ranger, he thought about the 3 strangers Mrs. Hutchins had seen. Copper Creek was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, so strangers stood out. The fact that they were armed and riding toward prospecting country raised red flags. The ride to Devil's Canyon took Morrison through some of the most beautiful and dangerous country in Arizona. The trail wound through forests of juniper and pinyon pine, past towering red sandstone formations that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. But Morrison barely noticed the scenery. His attention was focused on reading sign, looking for tracks that might tell him what had happened. About 5 miles out of town, he found what he was looking for. The trail showed clear evidence that 4 horses had passed this way recently. One heading north yesterday morning, the other 3 following in the afternoon. The tracks were clear in the soft earth near a creek crossing. Morrison dismounted and studied the tracks carefully. Cartwright's mare had distinctive shoes, with a nick in the left rear shoe. The other 3 horses had different shoes, and from the depth of the tracks, they were carrying heavy riders. One horse had an unusual wear pattern that would make it easy to identify. Following the trail required all of Morrison's tracking skills. In rocky areas, the tracks disappeared entirely, forcing him to search for scuff marks on stone and broken twigs on bushes. But the general direction was clear. They were all heading toward Devil's Canyon and the scattered mining claims in that area. As the afternoon wore on, Morrison found more evidence of trouble. At one point, the trail showed where the 3 pursuing horses had stopped, as if the riders were studying the ground or planning their next move. Nearby, he found the stub of a hand-rolled cigarette, still fresh enough that it couldn't have been there more than a day. The canyon country grew more rugged as Morrison rode deeper into the wilderness. Towering walls of red sandstone rose on either side of narrow valleys, creating a maze of passages and dead ends. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the sound of his horse's hooves on stone and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Near sunset, Morrison reached the general area where Cartwright's claim was supposed to be located. He could see evidence of mining activity, piles of tailings, the remains of a sluice box, and a small camp with a canvas shelter and fire ring. But there was no sign of Cartwright himself. Morrison approached the camp carefully, his rifle ready. The place had an abandoned feel, as if no one had been there for hours. Cartwright's mining tools were scattered around the claim, some of them thrown about, as if there had been a struggle. A coffee pot sat beside the cold ashes of a fire, and an unfinished meal of beans and hardtack sat on a tin plate. The prospector's bedroll was spread out under the canvas shelter, but it was obvious he hadn't slept in it the night before. Morrison found boot prints around the camp. Not just Cartwright's worn work boots, but the prints of at least 3 other men wearing different styles of footwear. Near the edge of camp, Morrison discovered something that made his blood run cold. The earth was disturbed and darkly stained. When he knelt and touched the soil, his fingers came away red. Someone had bled here, and recently. Following the blood trail, Morrison found where it led to a large boulder about 50 yards from camp. Behind the boulder, more disturbed earth showed where someone had been dragged. The trail continued toward a narrow passage between 2 rock walls, leading deeper into the canyon. Darkness was falling fast, and Morrison knew it would be dangerous to continue tracking in the dark. The canyon walls blocked most of the moonlight, and there were too many places where an ambush could be waiting. Reluctantly, he decided to make camp and continue the search at first light. Morrison found a defensible position among some large boulders where he could keep watch while Ranger rested. He didn't dare light a fire. If the men he was tracking were still in the area, smoke would give away his position. Instead, he ate cold biscuits and jerky while keeping his rifle close at hand. As he sat in the darkness, Morrison thought about Ben Cartwright and what might have happened to him. The evidence painted a grim picture. 3 armed men had followed the prospector to his remote claim, and there had been violence. The blood, the signs of struggle, and the abandoned camp all pointed to kidnapping or worse. But questions remained. Why had Cartwright's horse been released to run back to town? If the men had simply robbed and killed him, they would have taken the horse as well. The fact that the mare had been allowed to escape suggested something more complicated was happening. Morrison also puzzled over the note he'd found in the saddlebags. Someone had arranged a midnight meeting at an old mine shaft. Was this connected to Cartwright's disappearance, or was it something else entirely? And if there was supposed to be a meeting, who was supposed to attend? The night passed slowly, with Morrison dozing fitfully between periods of standing watch. Every sound made him alert. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the brush, the distant howl of a coyote, but there were no sounds of human activity, no signs that anyone else was nearby. As dawn approached, Morrison began to see the canyon walls taking shape against the lightening sky. The red sandstone seemed to glow with its own inner fire as the first rays of sunlight touched the highest peaks. It was going to be another clear, hot day, perfect for tracking. Morrison saddled Ranger and continued following the trail that led deeper into the canyon. The blood spots had stopped, but the tracks were still clear on the sandy floor of the passage. He moved slowly and carefully, constantly scanning the rim of the canyon for any sign of watchers. About a mile into the passage, Morrison found something that changed everything. Carved into the soft sandstone wall were initials and a message. B. C. Help. 3 men. Mine. The letters were fresh, cut with a knife or sharp stone. Probably within the last day. Ben Cartwright was alive, or at least he had been when he carved this message. And he'd managed to give Morrison crucial information. He was being held by 3 men at a mine. But which mine? The canyon country was dotted with abandoned shafts and prospect holes from years of mining activity. Morrison studied his map again, paying particular attention to the markings that showed old mines and prospects. There were at least a dozen possibilities within a few miles of Cartwright's claim, but one caught his attention. An old silver mine that had been abandoned years ago when the ore played out. It was marked on the map with the notation, "Deep shaft. Dangerous." The abandoned silver mine was the perfect place to hold a prisoner. It was remote, hidden in a side canyon, and the deep shaft would muffle any calls for help. Morrison felt certain this was where he would find either Ben Cartwright or answers about what had happened to him. As Morrison rode toward the abandoned mine, he reflected on how this case had developed. What had started with a simple runaway horse had quickly become something much more serious. 3 armed strangers, a missing prospector, evidence of violence, and now, a hidden message carved in stone. It all pointed to a carefully planned crime, but Morrison was puzzled by the motives. If the 3 men simply wanted to rob Cartwright, they could have done so and been gone by now. The fact that they seemed to be holding him suggested they wanted something more. Information. Perhaps. Or access to his gold claim. Maybe they thought he had more gold hidden somewhere, or knew the locations of other valuable claims. The sun was climbing higher as Morrison approached the area where the old silver mine was located. He dismounted and left Ranger hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees near a small creek. The final approach to the mine would have to be made on foot if he hoped to avoid detection. Morrison checked his weapons one more time and began the careful climb toward the mine entrance, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether Ben Cartwright lived or died. Sheriff Morrison crept through the thick brush and boulder fields that surrounded the abandoned sundown mine. Every step had to be calculated to avoid loose rocks that might give away his position. The mine entrance was carved into the face of a steep cliff, with a narrow ledge leading to the dark opening. Rusted mining equipment lay scattered around the site. Broken wheelbarrows, coils of rotting rope, and the skeletal remains of a wooden headframe. As Morrison drew closer, he began to hear voices echoing from within the mine shaft. The acoustic properties of the rocky canyon amplified and distorted the sounds, making it impossible to understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. Someone was angry, and someone else was in pain. Morrison found a position behind a large boulder about 60 yards from the mine entrance where he could observe without being seen. Through his field glasses, he could make out details that told him he was in the right place. 3 horses were picketed in a small grove of scrub oak near the mine entrance. Camping gear was scattered around a cold fire pit, and he could see rifle barrels glinting in the shadows just inside the mine opening. The voices from the mine grew louder, and Morrison could begin to make out individual words. A harsh, gravelly voice was doing most of the talking, punctuated occasionally by the sound of a blow and a muffled cry of pain. Morrison's jaw clenched as he realized what he was hearing. Someone was being tortured. "Where's the rest of it?" the gravelly voice demanded. "We know you found more than just that handful of dust in your saddlebags." A weaker voice, strained with pain, answered, "I told you. That's all there is." The claims barely producing enough to buy supplies. Morrison recognized the second voice as Ben Cartwright's. The prospector was alive, but clearly in serious trouble. The sound of another blow echoed from the mine, followed by Cartwright's suppressed groan. "You're lying," a different voice snarled. This one had a slight accent that Morrison couldn't place. "Jake saw you selling gold to that assayer in Flagstaff 2 weeks ago. Real gold, not just dust. You got yourself a secret stash somewhere." Morrison's mind raced. So that's what this was about. The 3 men thought Cartwright had discovered a rich vein and was hiding the bulk of his gold. They weren't just random thieves. They'd been watching him, following his movements, planning this kidnapping. A third voice joined the conversation, younger and more nervous than the others. "Maybe we should just take what we got and clear out, Wade. That horse made it to town by now. Could be the sheriff's already looking for him." "Shut up, Tommy," the gravelly voice. "Wade!" snapped. "The sheriff in that cow town probably thinks old Ben just fell off his horse drunk. Besides, we got business to finish here." Morrison heard the sound of metal scraping against stone, probably a knife being drawn. Wade's voice took on a more menacing tone. "Now then, Ben, let's try this again. You're gonna tell us where you hid the good gold, or we're gonna start cutting pieces off you." "I swear on my mother's grave," Cartwright gasped. "There ain't no more gold. The claim's about played out. Why do you think I was looking for new sites?" Morrison had heard enough. 3 armed men were torturing an innocent prospector based on false information. As sheriff, it was his duty to intervene. But the tactical situation was difficult. The men were in a defensible position inside the mine, and Morrison was outnumbered 3 to 1. He studied the terrain carefully, looking for any advantage he could find. The mine entrance faced east, meaning the afternoon sun would be shining directly into the eyes of anyone looking out. There was also a steep slope above the mine that might allow him to get into a better position. Moving as quietly as possible, Morrison began to work his way around to the north side of the cliff. The climb was treacherous, with loose shale that threatened to give way under his boots. But eventually, he found himself on a narrow ledge, about 30 feet above the mine entrance. From this vantage point, Morrison could see into the mine shaft. The 3 men had set up a rough camp just inside the entrance, where the natural light from outside provided enough illumination to see. Ben Cartwright was sitting against the far wall, his hands tied behind his back around a wooden support post. Even from a distance, Morrison could see that the prospector had been badly beaten. His face was swollen and bloody, and his clothes were torn. Wade turned out to be a big man with a full black beard, and the kind of pale skin that suggested he'd spent more time in saloons than outdoors. He wore expensive boots and a gun belt with 2 pistols, not the gear of a typical cowhand or prospector. The man with the accent was smaller and darker, possibly Mexican, with silver conchos on his hat and a wicked-looking knife in his hand. The youngest of the 3, Tommy, was barely more than a boy, maybe 18 or 20 years old. But he carried a rifle and had the nervous energy of someone trying to prove himself. Morrison realized he was looking at professional criminals, not desperate men acting on impulse. Everything about their operation suggested careful planning and experience with this kind of work. They'd probably done this before, in other mining camps in other territories. As Morrison watched, Wade pulled out a sheet of paper. The map Morrison had seen in Cartwright's saddlebags. This map shows 4 other claims you've been scouting. I'm betting at least one of them has a good stash hidden away. Cartwright shook his head weakly. Those are all played out, I tell you. I was just hoping to find some color. Maybe enough for coffee money. The Mexican drew his knife and tested the blade with his thumb. Let me work on him, Wade. I can make him talk. Not yet, Carlos. I got a better idea. Wade folded the map and put it in his shirt pocket. We're going to take a little trip to each of these claims. Ben here is going to show us exactly where he's been digging, and if we don't find what we're looking for. He let the threat hang in the air. Morrison saw his opportunity. The 3 men were focused on their prisoner and their conversation. If he could create enough confusion, he might be able to get Cartwright out alive. He checked his rifle one more time and picked up a handful of small stones. The first stone, thrown to his right, clattered down the cliff face and bounced off a piece of rusted mining equipment. All 3 men spun toward the sound, weapons drawn. What was that? Tommy whispered, his voice cracking with nervousness. Probably just a rock lizard or something, Wade said, but he kept his gun out. Carlos, go check it out. As Carlos moved toward the mine entrance to investigate, Morrison threw another stone in the opposite direction. This one landed in the brush to the left of the mine, rustling the leaves and creating more noise. That ain't no lizard, Carlos muttered, raising his rifle. Something's out there. Morrison waited until Carlos was completely outside the mine entrance, then called out in his most authoritative voice. This is Sheriff Morrison. You men are surrounded. Release your prisoner and come out with your hands up. The effect was immediate and chaotic. Carlos spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice. Wade cursed and dragged Cartwright to his feet. Pressing a gun to the prospector's head, Tommy dropped behind a pile of old timbers, his rifle pointed randomly toward the mine entrance. Surrounded my ass, Wade shouted. Show yourself, Sheriff, or the prospector dies right now. Morrison had expected this response. Desperate criminals often took hostages when cornered. He threw another stone to keep them guessing about his position. Then, called out again. Let Cartwright go and we can talk. You hurt him and I guarantee you'll hang for it. Carlos had spotted movement on the cliff face above and was trying to get a clear shot. Morrison pressed himself flat against the rock wall as a bullet whined off the stone near his head. I see him, Carlos yelled. He's up on the rocks. Wade pushed Cartwright toward the mine entrance, using him as a human shield. Come down here where we can see you, Sheriff. Or I put a bullet in Ben's brain right now. Morrison realized his bluff wasn't working. The criminals were too experienced to be scared off by threats of being surrounded. He was going to have to try a different approach. All right, he called out. I'm coming down. But if you hurt Cartwright, you'll answer to me personally. Morrison began to work his way down from the ledge, making enough noise to keep the criminals' attention focused on him. But instead of heading directly toward the mine entrance, he angled toward a position that would give him better cover and a cleaner shot. As he climbed down, Morrison could hear Wade giving orders to his men. Tommy, you keep that rifle pointed at the sheriff. Carlos, watch the other approaches. If this is some kind of trick, I want to know about it. Morrison reached the bottom of the cliff and stepped into view, his hands raised but still holding his rifle. I'm here. Now let Cartwright go. Wade laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the canyon walls. You think I'm stupid, Sheriff? Soon as I let him go, you'll start shooting. No. I think we'll keep old Ben with us for a while longer. What do you want? Morrison asked, trying to buy time while he assessed his options. Well, now that you mention it, Wade said, you might be just what we need. See? Ben here has been telling us fairy tales about his gold claims. Maybe you know something about prospectors in your territory. Maybe you know which ones have been doing real well lately. Morrison felt a chill as he realized what Wade was suggesting. The criminals weren't just after Cartwright's gold. They were planning to use Morrison's knowledge of the local area to identify other potential victims. "I don't know anything about private mining claims," Morrison lied. "That's not sheriff business." Carlos had worked his way around to Morrison's flank and was now pointing his rifle directly at the sheriff's chest. "He's lying. All sheriffs know who's got money and who don't. Maybe we need to persuade him the same way we've been persuading Ben," Tommy suggested, his young voice trying to sound tough. Wade considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "No. I got a better idea. Sheriff, you're going to help us check out these other claims Ben's been scouting. If we find gold, everybody stays happy. If we don't..." He pressed his gun harder against Cartwright's temple. Morrison realized he was trapped in an impossible situation. If he refused to cooperate, Wade would kill Cartwright immediately. If he agreed to help, he'd be leading the criminals to other innocent prospectors who would suffer the same fate. "How do I know you'll let us go if I help you?" Morrison asked. "You don't," Wade said with a grin. "But it's the only chance either of you got." Morrison made a show of considering the offer while actually studying the positions of all three men. Carlos was to his right, about 20 feet away, with a clear shot. Tommy was behind cover near the mine entrance, his rifle barrel visible but not his body. Wade was using Cartwright as a shield, making a clean shot impossible. "All right," Morrison said finally. "I'll help you. But we do this my way. No more beating on Cartwright. And no shooting unless someone tries to run. You ain't in a position to make demands." "Sheriff," Wade pointed out. "Maybe not, but I know this country better than you do. You want to find those claims without spending weeks wandering around lost. You need me alive and cooperative." Wade considered this, then nodded. "Fair enough. But just remember, any tricks, and Ben dies first." Morrison lowered his rifle and set it against a boulder. "No tricks, let's just get this done." But even as Morrison spoke the words, his mind was working on a plan. The criminals had made one crucial mistake. They assumed he was operating alone. In fact, Morrison had left a clear trail that any competent tracker could follow. If he didn't return to Copper Creek by tomorrow evening, Deputy Sam Wilson would come looking for him, probably with a posse. The question was whether Morrison could keep himself and Cartwright alive long enough for help to arrive. Wade gestured to Carlos. "Tie the sheriff's hands. We'll take both horses and ride to the first claim on Ben's map." As Carlos approached with a coil of rope, Morrison noticed something that gave him hope. The young criminal was nervous and careless, not paying attention to his footing on the uneven ground near the mine entrance. There were several loose rocks and pieces of old equipment that could cause a man to stumble at the wrong moment. Morrison also noted that Tommy was getting increasingly agitated. The young man kept looking toward the canyon entrance, as if expecting trouble to appear at any moment. He was the weak link in the group, the one most likely to make a mistake under pressure. "Hurry up," Wade snapped at Carlos. "We're losing daylight, and I want to check at least 2 claims before dark." Carlos bound Morrison's hands in front of him, but the sheriff deliberately tensed his wrists while the rope was being tied. It was an old trick he'd learned during his days as a deputy marshal. If you could maintain some space in the bonds, you might be able to work free later. Wade kept his gun on Cartwright as they prepared to leave the mine. "Carlos, you take point. Tommy, you watch our back trail. And Sheriff," he looked directly at Morrison, "you remember that Ben's life depends on your cooperation." As the group prepared to move out, Morrison caught Cartwright's eye and saw a flicker of hope there. The prospector was hurt, but not broken. If an opportunity presented itself, Morrison was confident that Cartwright would be ready to act. The first claim on Cartwright's map was about 2 miles away, in a narrow canyon that required single-file travel for most of the distance. Morrison realized this might work to his advantage. In such terrain, the criminals would have difficulty keeping watch on both prisoners while also watching for potential threats. As they rode out from the mine, Morrison made mental notes of landmarks and terrain features. If he got a chance to escape, he wanted to know exactly where he was and how to get back to help Cartwright. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. Soon it would be dark, and darkness would bring new opportunities for a man who knew the country well. Morrison just had to stay alive long enough to use them. The narrow canyon trail forced the group into single file, with Carlos leading, followed by Morrison, then Cartwright, with Wade close behind the prospector and Tommy bringing up the rear. The horses picked their way carefully over loose rocks and around fallen boulders, their hooves echoing off the canyon walls. Morrison had been studying the terrain carefully as they rode. The canyon twisted and turned, creating numerous blind spots where a man could disappear from view for several seconds at a time. The walls were steep but not impossible to climb in places, especially for someone familiar with rock climbing. About a mile into the canyon, Morrison got his first break. Carlos's horse stumbled on loose shale, causing the Mexican to curse and fight to keep his mount from falling. The momentary distraction gave Morrison the chance he'd been waiting for. When Carlos had tied Morrison's hands, the sheriff had kept his wrists slightly apart. During the ride, he'd been working the ropes back and forth, using the motion of his horse to help loosen the bonds. Now, with Carlos temporarily distracted, Morrison was able to slip one hand free. Morrison knew he had only seconds before someone noticed. He spurred his horse forward suddenly, as if trying to help Carlos, but instead veered sharply to the right, toward a narrow crack in the canyon wall. Behind him, he heard Wade shout in anger and surprise. "Stop him!" Wade yelled, but Morrison was already urging his horse up a steep slope toward the crack in the rocks. Carlos spun his horse around and raised his rifle. But Morrison was moving fast, and the angle was difficult. The shot went wide, striking sparks off the canyon wall. Morrison reached the crack and threw himself from his horse, rolling behind a large boulder as more shots rang out. "Carlos! Tommy! Get after him!" Wade roared. "I'll watch the prospector." Morrison heard the two criminals dismounting and beginning to climb after him. The crack in the canyon wall led to a narrow ledge that ran along the rim. If he could reach it, he'd have the high ground and a better defensive position. But Wade was no fool. "Sheriff," the outlaw called out, "you make another move and I kill Cartwright right now. You hear me?" Morrison froze. He was caught between the climbing men below and his responsibility to protect Cartwright. If he continued his escape, Wade would carry out his threat. If he surrendered, all three men would probably be killed anyway. Then Morrison heard something that changed everything. The distant sound of horses approaching the canyon entrance. Someone was coming, and coming fast. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, making it impossible to tell exactly how many riders there were, but it was definitely more than one. Wade heard it too. "Tommy, get back down here. Sounds like we got company." Carlos continued climbing toward Morrison's position, but Tommy scrambled back down to the canyon floor. Morrison could hear urgent whispered conversation below, but couldn't make out the words. The approaching horses were getting closer. Morrison risked a quick look over the edge of his hiding place and saw Wade dragging Cartwright toward a cluster of large boulders that would provide good defensive cover. The outlaw leader was preparing for a siege. Morrison realized this was probably Deputy Wilson, arriving with help. Sam Wilson was a competent lawman who would have followed Morrison's trail when the sheriff failed to return. But Wilson didn't know the tactical situation, that there were hostages and desperate criminals prepared to fight. Morrison made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation. He stood up on his ledge and shouted as loudly as he could, "Sam, it's a trap. 3 armed men holding Ben Cartwright hostage in the rocks." The warning cost him. Carlos, who had almost reached Morrison's position, now had a clear shot. The Mexican's rifle cracked, and Morrison felt the bullet crease his left arm, spinning him around and sending him tumbling off the ledge. Morrison hit the canyon floor hard, his right shoulder taking most of the impact. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to roll behind the nearest cover, a fallen tree trunk that had been washed down by some long-ago flash flood. "Sam Wilson," Wade called out, recognizing the name. "This is your lucky day. You can ride out of here alive if you just turn around and leave. If you don't, I start killing hostages." Morrison heard horses approaching the mouth of the canyon but couldn't see them from his position. Wilson's voice echoed off the rocks. "We know you're in there, Wade. We got the canyon surrounded. Let the hostages go and come out peaceful." Morrison was surprised that Wilson knew Wade's name. But then he remembered. Wanted posters. Wade must be a known criminal, with a price on his head. That would explain the professional way he and his gang had operated. "Surrounded?" Wade laughed harshly. "I count maybe 4, 5 horses out there. That ain't enough." "Deputy." Wade was probably right. Copper Creek was too small to raise a large posse on short notice. Wilson had probably brought whoever he could find quickly. Maybe 4 or 5 men at most. Carlos had climbed back down from his pursuit and was now positioned behind a boulder with a clear view of the canyon entrance. Tommy was nervous, constantly shifting position and checking his rifle. Morrison could see that the young outlaw was close to panic. "Wade," Wilson called again. "I know about your operation in Colorado. I know about the prospectors you killed in Nevada. You surrender now, and you might see trial instead of a rope." So Wade was wanted for multiple murders. Morrison felt his blood run cold as he realized how desperate these men really were. They had nothing to lose by killing their hostages. Morrison assessed his situation. His left arm was bleeding but still functional. His rifle was somewhere back where he'd dropped it when the shooting started. His revolver was still in its holster, but from his current position he couldn't get a clear shot at any of the 3 criminals. The standoff continued for several minutes, with Wilson trying to negotiate and Wade refusing to give up his hostages. Morrison could tell that tensions were rising. Someone was going to do something stupid soon. And when they did, people would die. Then Morrison heard movement behind him and turned to see a familiar figure crawling through the brush. It was Doc Henley, the town physician, carrying a medical bag and moving with surprising agility for a man his age. "Doc, what are you doing here?" Morrison whispered. "Sam figured there might be wounded," Henley replied quietly. "I came with the posse. How bad are you hurt?" Morrison looked at his bleeding arm. "I'll live. But we've got to get Ben Cartwright away from Wade before this turns into a shooting match." Henley nodded toward the rocks where Wade was holding Cartwright. "I can see them from here. The prospector looks in bad shape. If this goes on much longer, he might not survive anyway." Morrison had an idea. "Doc, you still got that little derringer you carry for emergencies?" Henley patted his jacket pocket. "Never leave home without it. But it's only got 2 shots, and the range is maybe 10 feet. That might be enough. Here's what we're going to do." Morrison explained his plan quickly. It was risky, but it was better than letting the standoff continue until someone started shooting. Henley listened carefully, then nodded grimly. "It's crazy," the doctor said, "but it might work." Morrison began working his way through the brush toward Wade's position, staying low and moving slowly to avoid making noise. Henley waited 60 seconds, then began moving in the opposite direction. The plan depended on timing and luck. Morrison needed to get close enough to Wade to take him down physically, while Henley created a distraction from the other side. It wasn't fancy, but it was the best option available. As Morrison crept closer, he could hear Wade talking to Cartwright in a low, menacing voice. "When this is over, old man, you and me are going to have a final conversation about that gold, and this time, you're going to tell me the truth." Morrison was now within 20 feet of Wade's position. He could see the outlaw clearly. A big man, with broad shoulders and thick arms. Holding a Colt revolver pressed against Cartwright's head, the prospector looked barely conscious, his face pale and his breathing shallow. From the canyon entrance, Wilson called out again. "Wade, time's running out. My men are getting restless. Let them come," Wade shouted back. "For every man you send in here, I'll kill a hostage." That's when Henley made his move. The elderly doctor suddenly appeared on the far side of the rocks, apparently lost and confused. "Hello? Sheriff Morrison? I'm looking for Sheriff Morrison." Wade spun toward this unexpected threat, momentarily taking his gun away from Cartwright's head. "Who the hell are you?" Morrison launched himself from his hiding place, covering the 20 feet in 3 quick bounds. He hit Wade from behind, wrapping his arms around the bigger man and driving them both to the ground. Wade was strong and experienced in close combat. He twisted in Morrison's grip and brought his elbow back hard into the sheriff's ribs. Morrison gasped in pain but held on, fighting to control Wade's gun hand. "Carlos! Tommy!" Wade shouted as he struggled. "Help me!" But Carlos was dealing with his own problems. At the sound of fighting, Wilson and his posse had charged into the canyon. The Mexican was exchanging shots with multiple targets, trying to cover too many angles at once. Tommy, meanwhile, had finally reached his breaking point. The young outlaw threw down his rifle and ran toward the canyon entrance with his hands raised, screaming, "I surrender! I surrender! Don't shoot!" Morrison and Wade rolled across the rocky ground, each trying to gain control of Wade's revolver. Morrison's wounded arm was weakening, and Wade was gradually gaining the upper hand. The outlaw managed to get on top and was slowly forcing the gun toward Morrison's head. "Should have minded your own business, Sheriff," Wade snarled. Morrison saw the finger tightening on the trigger and knew he was out of time. Then Henley's little derringer spoke from close range. The bullet took Wade in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his revolver flying. Morrison didn't waste the opportunity. He rolled clear and scrambled for Wade's dropped gun, reaching it just as the wounded outlaw was getting to his feet. Morrison pointed the revolver at Wade's chest and said simply, "It's over." Wade looked around at the situation. Carlos was down with a bullet in his leg. Tommy had surrendered, and Morrison had a gun on him. His shoulders sagged in defeat. "Yeah, I reckon it is." Wilson and the posse secured the 3 prisoners, while Morrison and Henley rushed to check on Cartwright. The prospector was conscious but in serious condition from the beating he'd endured. Henley worked quickly to stabilize him while Morrison explained what had happened. "They thought he was hiding a large stash of gold," Morrison told Wilson. "Turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. They saw him selling some dust in Flagstaff and assumed he was holding back the good stuff." Wilson shook his head in disgust. "Men like that'll kill for a few dollars worth of gold dust. Good thing that horse made it to town, or we might never have found them." As the posse prepared to head back to Copper Creek, Morrison took one last look around the canyon. It was hard to believe that so much violence had erupted in such a peaceful place. The red rock walls seemed to glow in the setting sun, and the only sounds were the wind through the pinyon pines and the distant call of a hawk. The ride back to town took most of the night, with frequent stops to check on Cartwright's condition. The prospector was tough, though, and by the time they reached Copper Creek, he was sitting up in his saddle and even managing to joke about his ordeal. "Next time I find a good claim," he told Morrison, "I'm keeping my mouth shut about it." The 3 outlaws were locked up in Copper Creek's small jail to await transport to the territorial capital for trial. Tommy, being young and cooperative, would probably get off with a few years in prison. Carlos would face multiple charges, including kidnapping and attempted murder. Wade, with his record of previous crimes, would almost certainly hang. Morrison spent the rest of the morning writing up his report and sending telegrams to territorial authorities about the capture of the wanted men. It turned out that Wade was worth $500 in reward money, enough to pay for several improvements to the town's law enforcement capabilities. Ben Cartwright recovered from his injuries over the next few weeks. Doc Henley treated him for broken ribs, numerous cuts and bruises, and a concussion. The prospector eventually returned to his claim, but he took Morrison's advice and invested in a good watchdog to alert him to any unwanted visitors. The reward money was split among the members of the posse, with Cartwright insisting that Morrison take the largest share. "If it weren't for you," he told the sheriff, "I'd be dead in that mine shaft right now." Morrison used his share of the reward to buy a better rifle and to improve the jail's security. He also convinced the town council to approve funds for a deputy position, reasoning that the incident had shown how quickly situations could develop beyond what one man could handle alone. About a month after the incident, Morrison was sitting on his office porch, enjoying his morning coffee when he heard the now familiar sound of hoofbeats approaching. For a moment, his hand moved instinctively toward his gun, But then he saw it was just Tom Peterson, riding in from his ranch with supplies for his store. Peterson waved as he passed, and Morrison waved back. Life in Copper Creek had returned to its normal, peaceful rhythm. The excitement was over, the criminals were behind bars, and justice had been served. Morrison reflected on how the whole case had started, with nothing more than a riderless horse. In frontier towns like Copper Creek, people learned to pay attention to such signs. A horse without its rider usually meant trouble, and in this case, it had meant the difference between life and death for Ben Cartwright. As Morrison finished his coffee and prepared to start another day of keeping the peace in Copper Creek, he made a mental note to always trust his instincts about such things. Sometimes the smallest details could lead to the biggest discoveries. And sometimes, a runaway horse could be the key to solving a serious crime. The mare that had carried the warning was now peacefully grazing in Peterson's corral, fully recovered from her terrifying ride through the desert. She had played her part in the drama perfectly, carrying the message that brought help when it was needed most. Morrison stood up and walked into his office, ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring. In a frontier town, there was always something that needed the sheriff's attention. But for now, at least, the people of Copper Creek could sleep soundly, knowing that justice had been done and their sheriff was watching over them.